Have you ever, like, just stopped to think about how we decide what's right and what's wrong? It's something we're all doing all the time, right? Sorting through all these actions, ideas, behaviors. It's kind of like we're all these amateur philosophers in a way,
Yeah.
trying to make sense of the world and where we fit into it all.
Oh, that's a really interesting way to put it. Yeah. And that very human thing that, trying to figure out right from wrong, how that's different from just following the rules. That's exactly what we're diving into today. This whole fascinating line between, morality and just convention. Often it can be pretty blurry too.
And to help us get through all of it, we've got some really great material to work with today. Excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the moral conventional distinction. It's a really deep dive into the psychology and philosophy of this whole question.
Yeah, and it's not just, an academic thing either. This is relevant to all of us. Understanding how we categorize our judgment. I mean, what we see is like a truly moral issue versus just, a social custom. It affects how we see ourselves, how we get along with each other, and how we deal with, well, all sorts of societal issues, really. So our mission today is to unpack all of this, all these complexities.
Okay, so let's get philosophical then and really get into it. This whole question of, is there a real difference between moral judgments and conventional judgments? It seems like that discussion really got going with the work of psychologist Elliot Turiel back in the 1970s.
Yeah, that's right. What's so interesting about Turiel is that he, in a way, was acting like a philosopher of the mind himself. He was inspired by, earlier philosophical work on the nature of morality and convention. And then he came up with these really clever experiments. One of the classic ones, he looked at how little kids responded to what he called prototypical moral transgressions, like hitting another kid. And then he compared that to what he called prototypical conventional transgressions, like showing up at school wearing your pajamas.
And the results were pretty striking, right?
Yeah.
Kids, it seems like they reacted in totally different ways.
Yeah.
Like they saw hitting is wrong, in this really serious way, not just because it was against the rules, but the pajamas thing, not so much. So even as little kids, it seems like we kind of get that there are different kinds of rules, not just like one big set of don'ts.
Exactly, yeah. And from those observations, Turiel, he put forward his initial definition of what morality is. Basically, he said, at its core, it has to involve harm, injustice, or violating someone's rights. Those were the key things that he thought triggered that specific moral kind of judgment.
But it didn't stop there, right? Other researchers, people like Schwitter and Haidt, they came
Uh,
along and they said maybe Turiel's definition is a little bit too narrow, especially when you start to look at different cultures, around the world.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting, how universal is our understanding of morality, really.
Right.
That's a big philosophical question. Shredder and Haidt, they pointed out that in lots of non-Western cultures, people treat a much wider range of actions as moral transgressions, things that don't necessarily involve obvious harm or injustice, the way Turiel defined them. And so that started a big debate about how much moral thinking really varies across different societies and whether our philosophical frameworks need to be more inclusive of those different perspectives.
And it wasn't just, psychologists who were interested in Turiel's work. Philosophers got really into it too. They saw a lot of interesting angles to explore, almost like acting as interpreters of these psychological findings.
Absolutely. If we zoom out a bit and look at the wider context of philosophy, Turiel's findings became relevant to all sorts of debates. Think about, for instance, moral nativism, this idea that we're born with some sort of, built-in moral understanding. Turiel's work with those little kids, it seemed to support that at least a little bit. And his work also got tied into discussions about moral sentimentalism,
Yeah.
which, that emphasizes how our emotions affect our moral judgments. And then there's moral internalism, which is about the connection between our moral judgments and our motivation to act accordingly. So basically, if you know something's wrong, does that automatically mean you don't want to do it?
Yeah, and it even got into some pretty heavy philosophical areas, like the moral responsibility of psychopaths. I mean, it makes you wonder if someone doesn't seem to get the difference between right and wrong the same way most of us do, then what does that mean for for holding them accountable.
Yeah, exactly. It becomes a really challenging question. That distinction between moral and conventional judgments, it became this lens for looking at all these really fundamental questions in philosophy, about human nature, about responsibility.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that before Turiel came along, philosophers were mostly focused on distinguishing moral judgments from non-moral judgments. Things like what's practical or what's beautiful or what religious rules tell us to do. They weren't necessarily trying to separate moral from immoral actions the way Turiel was.
That's a really crucial point, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
if we're trying to, be philosophers ourselves and understand this whole debate, we got to remember that those earlier philosophers, they weren't necessarily trying to draw the exact same line Turiel was looking at.
Right. And what's fascinating is that even within that earlier philosophical work, there was so much disagreement about how to define morality. Some philosophers, they wanted to just describe how we actually use the word moral in everyday life. And others, they wanted to be more normative, like telling us how we should be using it. And then there were all these different criteria that people proposed, like universalizability, which means, moral rules should apply to everyone in similar situations, or prescriptivity, the idea that moral rules should guide our actions. And then there were ideas like overriding importance, which means, moral rules are more important than other types of considerations, and also whether breaking moral rules should lead to social punishment.
So even before Turiel came in with his psychological experiments and everything, just trying to define morality was a huge philosophical debate with no clear answer.
Yeah, exactly. It was a real philosophical puzzle. And Turiel's project, it comes out of all of that uncertainty. And he was pretty skeptical of some of those earlier differentiation models of moral development, like the ones by Piaget and Kohlberg. They said that little kids, they see all rules as basically the same, like imposed by authority figures.
But Turiel, he didn't think that was quite right. He thought that even young kids, they have this sense that some things are morally wrong in a much deeper way than just breaking a rule.
Right. Right, exactly. He believed that moral and conventional thinking are different pretty much from the beginning. So to test this, he needed a way to see whether a child's judgment about, something they did wrong was moral or conventional. And here's where his inspiration from philosophy really comes in.
Yeah.
He took these concepts like universalizability and what he called categoricalness, which is, the idea that moral duties, they're not dependent on who's in charge. He took those ideas and turn them into things he could actually measure in his experiments.
So when Turiel was talking about universalizability, he wasn't just using that abstract philosophical definition. He was looking at whether a kid thought that an action was wrong for everyone in similar situations, no matter where or when. It's kind of like the golden rule, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. It applies to everyone.
Exactly, yeah. And categoricalness for him, he turned that into authority independence. So if a kid thought hitting was wrong, even if their teacher or parents said it was okay, that suggested they were making a moral judgment. And he really zeroed in on harm, justice, and rights. He saw those as the defining features of moral judgments, and he connected that to his view that kids are actively building their understanding of morality through, their experiences and how they reason things out.
And then he contrasted that with how he saw social conventions, which he saw as more localized, things that could change and that were about keeping social interactions smooth, like table manners or how you address someone.
Yeah.
Those things are more about social coordination than fundamental right and wrong.
Exactly. So, if a kid thought wearing pajamas to school was wrong only because the school had a rule against it and that it might be okay at a different school, or if the rule changed, that pointed to a conventional judgment.
And then they designed these experiments, these little stories, or vignettes, as they're called. And after each story, he'd ask the kids these questions to see how they judged what happened.
Those questions were key, yeah. He'd ask things like, was it wrong? Would it be okay if the teacher said it was okay? Would it be wrong at a different school? Those were his criterion judgments. So just to be clear for our listeners, those criterion judgments are specifically about whether the kids thought a rule applied to everyone, not just because someone in charge said so. And then he also asked them to explain why they thought the action was wrong, looking for, reasons related to harm or fairness for the moral transgressions. And then for the conventional ones, he looked for appeals to rules or just keeping order.
And his initial findings, from the 70s and into the 80s, they really seemed to support his ideas. Like, kids were pretty consistent in how they separated things, like hitting or stealing, which they saw as always wrong no matter what, from things like chewing gum in class or talking out of turn, which they saw as, more dependent on the situation.
Yeah, it was a big step forward in how we think about moral development. It really challenged that old idea that, little kids, they just have this one big sense of rules and they don't really differentiate. Turiel showed that their understanding of norms was actually much more nuanced and complex, even from a very early age.
Okay, but then if we're going to, keep being philosophers here, the question becomes, does this moral pattern, authority, independence, and generalizability, does that really tell us for sure that a judgment is moral in some, deeper sense? Just because kids treat some things differently, does that automatically mean those things belong to this special moral category?
Oh, that's a really important point. As we talked about earlier, even philosophers, they couldn't agree on one definition of what makes a judgment moral. So just because Turiel used some of those debated criteria, it doesn't necessarily mean that those are the definitive markers of true morality. It's much more complex than that.
But some researchers, they came up with this natural kind defense to support Turiel's approach, right? This idea that moral judgment is a real psychological category, something that science can help us define, just like we define, other natural phenomena.
That's right. The argument, it was put forward by Kelly and then later developed by Kumar and Stitch. And they said that moral judgment could be like water or gold, a natural kind, and that it has these essential features that we can discover through empirical research, and in this case, psychology. So the idea is that judgments about morality, they should cluster together in predictable ways.
So it's like we look at what we intuitively think are moral actions, and then we try to find what's similar in how people judge them, things like authority, independence, and generalizability. And we say, okay, maybe these shared properties are what make a judgment moral. It's like we're trying to find the essence of our moral intuitions by observing how people's minds work.
Yeah, exactly. So if most people across different ages and cultures, if they consistently judge certain actions, things we intuitively think are moral, as authority, independent, and generalizable, and then they judge actions that are, conventionally wrong as not having those features, well, that would make this natural kind argument stronger.
And there was a lot of research that seemed to support this idea, right? Studies showing these patterns in, little kids, across cultures, and even in people with developmental disorders.
Exactly. And the fact that they found these patterns in so many different groups of people, that was seen as strong evidence for the natural kind view. But there were some studies that didn't quite fit, like studies involving religious rules or etiquette violations. People who support the natural kind view, they said, well, those are just exceptions. They don't necessarily disprove the overall pattern. And they pointed out that, even natural kinds can have fuzzy boundaries.
But then it got a little more complicated when researchers started to look at more, how do I put it, more serious, more grown-up moral issues. Things like slavery or beating your wife. This is where things get really tricky, I think.
Yeah, and this is where Stinch argues that the natural kind defense really starts to break down, because some studies, they use these more serious moral transgressions, and they found that people's judgments didn't always follow the typical moral pattern, the authority, independence, and generalizability. So that suggests that our categories for moral thinking, they might be a lot more fluid, a lot more context dependent than we think. And it raises questions about whether the patterns you find with, more everyday transgressions, like the ones kids make, whether those patterns hold up when you're talking about these really, really serious issues. There's still a lot of debate going on about how these studies were done and how to interpret the results. So the question of whether the natural kind defense really works, that's still very much up in the air.
It seems like even figuring out what counts as moral within Turiel's framework, that's been a whole evolving project, like almost a philosophical debate in itself. He started with just justice, then he added rights, welfare, and harm, and then even later he included fairness and equality. It seems like he kept adding to the definition.
And the important thing to understand here is that these weren't just, random additions. Turiel and his colleagues, they saw these as empirical hypotheses, things that they were constantly testing and refining based on the data they collected, and also insights from philosophy. They weren't just trying to capture how we, casually use the word moral in everyday speech. He called it a recursive strategy, which means, you start with an idea, you gather evidence, and then you revise your idea based on what you found. It's this back and forth process, trying to really pin down these social cognitive domains.
So he was saying that how we use the words morality and convention in everyday life, that's often messy and inconsistent. And so his definitions, they were more about trying to identify these underlying psychological categories, even if they don't perfectly match up with how we normally use the words.
Exactly. He was trying to get at the core psychological distinctions, regardless of the labels that we might use casually.
And this is where those cross-cultural challenges to Turiel's definition become really important. Like Schwader's research in India, for instance, he seemed to show that people there treat certain actions as serious moral issues, even though to a Westerner, there's no obvious harm involved.
Yeah, and this was a major point of disagreement. It really makes us question whether this idea of harm-based morality, whether that's really universal. Schwader, he gave examples like a son getting a haircut right after his father dies, or a widow eating fish. And the people he interviewed in India, they saw those as serious moral violations, even though, to a Westerner, they wouldn't seem to involve harm in the typical sense.
But Turiel, he argued back that these judgments, they might actually be based on different non-moral beliefs about what causes harm. So it wasn't that their definition of morality was different. It was their beliefs about what was harmful that were leading to those judgments.
Right, yeah. And then Haidt came along with his research on what he called harmless taboo violations, things like eating a dog that had died, or kissing your sibling. And what he found was that people in lower socioeconomic groups, they were more likely to see these actions as morally wrong, even though they couldn't really explain what harm was being done.
And that really challenged Turiel's definition, didn't it? It made it seem like maybe harm and justice weren't the only things that matter when we're deciding what's moral. But Turiel, he also criticized the methods of these studies. He didn't like how they used questions about punishment to identify moral judgments, because he said that both moral and conventional transgressions, they could be punished. So that doesn't really tell you which is which.
Exactly. And more recent studies, they've tried to, fix those methodological problems, and they've used Turiel's style of criterion judgments with Haidt's style of, these less obvious transgressions. And some of them have found evidence that yeah, people actually do apply moral criterion judgments to actions that they themselves say are harmless. So the question of how well Turiel's definition really holds up across cultures, and whether we need to broaden our understanding of morality, that's still very much an open question.
And it's not just, cross-cultural differences, right? Even within Western cultures, there are some actions that are non-prototypical, I guess you could call them, that seem to challenge Turiel's definition, like incest, for instance. Often people have really strong moral reactions to that, even if there's no clear harm involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Turiel and his team, they looked at judgments about things like abortion, pornography, homosexuality, and incest. And incest was especially interesting because a lot of people, they gave those moral criterion judgments. They said it was universally wrong no matter what authority figure said. But they didn't always explain it in terms of harm. They talked about things like deterministic beliefs or custom and tradition. So it seems like our understanding of these basic categories, it really depends on the perspective we're taking, whether it's, a psychology experiment or a philosophical theory.
And it seemed like even Turiel, he was a bit hesitant to classify those judgments about incest as truly moral, at least within his own framework. He really wanted to stick to his focus on harm, fairness, and rights as the hallmarks of real morality. It almost seemed like he was admitting that there's this gap in his definition, these places where our moral compass is pointing, but it doesn't really line up neatly with his theory.
Right. It shows how hard it is to create a definition that's, clean and all-encompassing, one that captures all of the little nuances of our moral intuitions. Our moral sense is really complex.
And this all brings us to this bigger philosophical question about where moral judgments come from in the first place. Like, how do we develop this sense of right and wrong? Turiel had this constructivist view, right? He emphasized the role of reasoning and how we perceive harm and injustice. Those are like the building blocks for our moral understanding, according to him.
Yeah, and he uses this example of a kid pushing another kid on a swing to explain his idea. He
Yeah.
says that a child can understand that the pushing is wrong just by seeing that the other kid is hurt and by considering the intentions of the kid who did the pushing, and they can figure that out even if no one specifically tells them it's wrong. So it's like we're actively constructing our moral knowledge through what we experience and how we think things through.
But there are definitely some unanswered questions there, right? Like how exactly do kids perceive the validity of someone's motives? And why is it that no harm is seen as better, as more desirable? What are the unspoken moral assumptions that we're bringing to these situations?
And those are exactly the points that critics of Turiel's model have raised.
Right.
Like Sean Nichols, for instance, he offers a different explanation. He focuses on social learning and the role of affect, which is, our emotions.
Mhm.
He talks about norms with feeling and says that moral norms, they're the ones that are connected to a strong emotional response.
And he even did experiments where he looked at violations of disgust. And what he found is that people, they treat those violations in a similar way to how they treat moral transgressions, in terms of authority, independence, and all that, even if they don't necessarily see those violations as causing harm. So that suggests that maybe our emotional reactions, they're even more important than pure reasoning when it comes to moral judgments.
Right. Yeah. But then Roisman and his colleagues, they challenged Nichols's findings. They said that even in those discussed scenarios, it might be the perception of harm that's driving those moral responses, not just the feeling of disgust itself. And they even proposed this really interesting idea, this nativist idea that we have this built-in proto-prohibition against harm. Like it's a basic moral instinct that we're born with.
And then they had that really thought-provoking but also kind of unsettling suggestion about how differences in moral judgments between people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They said that maybe those differences are actually connected to differences in cognitive abilities, specifically the ability to think about counterfactuals, to imagine different possibilities and think about less obvious harms. It makes you wonder if some of those really fundamental disagreements that people have about morality, maybe those disagreements are actually coming from differences in how people process information and think about potential consequences. I mean, that's pretty deep.
It is, yeah. It's a controversial idea, but it shows just how incredibly complex it is to understand where our moral judgments come from and all the different things that might shape our sense of right and wrong.
So after all of this, all this exploration of the psychology and the philosophy of it all, what can we really say about what the moral conventional task tells us about moral judgments? And
Yeah.
it seems like there are so many different interpretations out there, depending on what your underlying philosophical assumptions are.
Yeah, and that's the heart of the issue, isn't it? The social domain theorists, they think it identifies judgments about harm, justice, and rights. Other people, they argue it captures a much broader range of things, stuff influenced by culture and emotions, or maybe just harm for people who are good at reasoning. And this is a really crucial question because it affects how we understand moral judgments, and it also affects research in psychology and neuroscience. It shapes how we interpret all sorts of findings.
And the fact that philosophers haven't really been able to agree on a single definition of morality, that makes it even harder to be sure that these tasks are really measuring something we can all agree on.
Yeah, I mean, the natural kind defense, that was a possible way to get around that problem by focusing on psychological coherence. But then those challenges we talked about earlier, they raise doubts about whether judgments on the moral conventional task, they really form those neat nomological clusters, the idea that judgments about morality should always group together in predictable ways. Well, that doesn't seem to always be true. And the fact that people's judgments about serious transgressions, they can change depending on how, distant or removed those transgressions are. And then there's the huge range of moral issues that haven't even been studied across cultures. All of that adds to the uncertainty.
But then you have the argument that maybe some of those inconsistencies are just because of poor reasoning. And that brings up the role of our cognitive abilities in shaping our moral judgments. So it seems like we need a lot more research to really be sure about what these tasks are telling us about moral judgment, and to develop more solid philosophical frameworks for understanding all of it.
Absolutely. It's like a a giant puzzle, and we're still missing a lot of the pieces. And we need, we need psychologists and philosophers to keep talking to each other to figure it all out.
And even with all these debates and uncertainties, philosophers have found that the moral conventional task, it's been a pretty useful tool for them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Dwyer, for instance, he made this really interesting comparison to Chomsky's work on language. He suggested that there might be a kind of universal moral grammar, an innate structure in our minds that underlies our moral judgments. And then Nichols, he used the task to critique sentimentalist theories of morality. He argued that because moral judgment shows up in kids so early, that challenges the idea that it's tied to understanding these complex emotions like guilt.
And then Heath, he argued that philosophers have been drawn to this moral conventional distinction as a way to kind of push back against moral relativism, to show that morality isn't just about, cultural conventions, but that it has this deeper, more universal basis.
Right. And the findings from the task, they've been used to support arguments for moral nativism, the idea that some parts of morality are inborn. But that's definitely a controversial view in philosophy, and there are a lot of counter arguments.
And then maybe one of the most common ways that the task has been used is in the debates about moral internalism and the moral responsibility of psychopaths. A lot of that is based on Blair's studies, which use the moral conventional task. And this is a place where, what psychologists are finding has really direct implications for how philosophers understand moral agency.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting area, but also really ethically complex. You have these philosophical theories, and then you have these real world challenges. The idea is that the psychopaths, they seem to know right from wrong intellectually, but they don't have the emotional connection to it. And some people argue that this challenges the internalist view, the view that moral judgment it inherently leads to wanting to do the right thing. And Blair's findings, they suggested that psychopaths, they don't distinguish between moral and conventional transgressions in the same way that other people do. So some people said, well, maybe that means they don't really have normal moral concepts, and so they're not really making moral judgments in the first place.
Which then has huge implications for whether we can hold them morally responsible, right? Some people argue that if they don't really grasp that moral conventional distinction, then that excuses them from moral responsibility and maybe even from criminal responsibility. But other people, they say, no, they're aware of social norms, and that's enough to hold them accountable.
Right, and then there are the critiques of Blair's work. Some people point out that there are problems with the task itself, and there are studies that didn't find the same results that Blair did. Like there's the research by Aharoni and his colleagues, for instance. They didn't find any correlation between psychopathy scores and how people did on the task. And then there's the review by Scheich-Borg and Sinnott Armstrong. They suggested that any deficits in moral judgment that psychopaths might have are probably very, very subtle. So it all shows that we've got to be really careful about jumping to big philosophical conclusions about these complex issues, like moral responsibility based on psychological research that's still ongoing and that people are still debating.
It really emphasizes the need for careful philosophical thinking when we're interpreting these psychological findings, and it shows that psychology and philosophy, they need to keep talking to each other. It seems like the moral conventional task, it's been a really influential tool, but it's also a lot more nuanced and debated than it might seem at first glance. And we really got to be cautious about the philosophical conclusions we draw from it.
I agree. Yeah, we need to be really cautious, especially when we're using these findings to support big philosophical claims about human nature and moral responsibility.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the moral conventional distinction, it's clear that trying to understand the foundations of our moral judgments, it's a complex and ongoing project. We've looked at Elliott Turiel's work, which has been really groundbreaking but also controversial. We've seen how what people consider moral can vary across cultures. We've talked about those ongoing debates about what moral judgments are and where they come from.
Yeah, and for you listening, it's important to take away that what might seem like a simple difference between right and wrong and just social rules, well, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. It's an area that both psychologists and philosophers are actively researching and thinking about, and it requires all of us to keep questioning our assumptions and to consider different perspectives.
Yeah.